For years, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been defined by a single, persistent line of attack. One man, more than any other, has wielded it like a weapon: Donald Trump. His entire foreign policy has been built around the idea that America's allies were freeloaders, and his favorite target was always Canada. He called them out for low defense spending, using it as a justification for a brutal trade war. It became a constant refrain at his rallies and press conferences. He even floated bizarre rhetoric about annexing Canada, suggesting it should become the 51st state. It was his biggest card, the ultimate point of leverage he held over a key ally. Well, as of today, that relationship has been fundamentally altered, but not in the way you might think. This isn't a story about defense spending, it's about economics. Facing an escalating trade war and threats of crippling 100% tariffs, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has just laid down a new doctrine. It's a quiet declaration of economic independence, a strategic pivot to diversify away from the U.S. and build a resilient, made-in-Canada economy. Trump may have thought he could bully Canada into submission, but he may have just pushed them to become a stronger, more independent competitor. In doing so, he might have just lost his biggest card. To get how big of a deal this is, you have to understand the before state. For the better part of a decade, Canada's relationship with the U.S. has been under strain. A big part of that, to be fair, was defense spending. After the Cold War, like many Western nations, Canada's defense budget became an afterthought. By 2014, spending had dropped to just 1% of its GDP. To the United States, which carries most of NATO's weight, this was a constant source of frustration. But no one weaponized that frustration like Donald Trump. In his eyes, alliances weren't about shared values, they were about dollars and cents. Any ally not spending 2% of their GDP on their military was delinquent. And Canada was, in his words, just about the lowest of them all. It became a drumbeat in every interaction. But this wasn't just talk. It was policy. Trump used this argument to help justify a trade war, imposing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. This escalated into a much larger conflict, with Trump threatening tariffs as high as 100% on all Canadian goods, justifying it by citing the flow of fentanyl across the border, even though Canada accounts for only 1% of U.S. fentanyl imports. This rhetoric of a dependent, freeloading neighbor was Trump's ultimate leverage. It was the justification for tariffs and the foundation for threats. For years, Canada didn't have a great rebuttal. Its spending record, projected to be just 1.37% of GDP in 2024, spoke for itself. That was the old reality, one of American pressure, Canadian apologies, and a power imbalance defined by a trade war with no end in sight. And then, things started to change. With Mark Carney taking over as Prime Minister, Canada's response to the trade war has shifted from reactive to proactive. Instead of just retaliating with counter tariffs, his government is charting a new course. The new strategy is clear. If Canada can't rely on its most important trading partner, it will learn to rely on itself. In a series of statements, Carney has laid out a plan focused on what Canada can control, building a strong, resilient domestic economy and diversifying its trade relationships. He's called for a true made-in-Canada strategy to make the country less vulnerable to shocks from the U.S. This isn't just rhetoric. It's backed by a new federal budget that lays the groundwork for this shift, moving from reliance to resilience. The government's new trade diversification strategy aims to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade, focusing on fast-growing markets in the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Carney's administration has announced plans for major nation-building projects, with the potential to spark over $500 billion in new domestic investments. The message is clear: Canada will become its own best customer. Carney has framed this not as a concession, but as a recognition of a new, harsher global reality, where economic interdependence can be used as a weapon. In a speech, he argued that you can monetize a position of power for a time, but you can't do that forever. He has essentially called Trump's bluff, signaling that Canada will respond to economic pressure not by folding, but by building an economy that is no longer dependent on Washington's approval. This is Canada's own declaration of independence. This pivot is more than just a new budget item. It's a seismic event in the US-Canada relationship. The implications are profound, touching everything from presidential politics to the future of North American trade. Let's be blunt. Donald Trump's primary tool for bullying Canada has been economic intimidation. He has justified tariffs on everything from steel to cars by painting Canada as a dependent nation that needs to be brought to heel. That narrative is now falling apart. His justification for the trade war now looks like naked protectionism, making it much harder to sell to American businesses and consumers paying the price. When Carney's government dismisses the national security basis for tariffs on issues like fentanyl as pretext, it exposes the trade war as a purely economic conflict. Trump's leverage was based on the idea that Canada had no choice but to absorb the pressure. But Carney's strategy offers an alternative: resilience and diversification. It's a masterclass in strategic jiu-jitsu. It takes Trump's greatest strength, his ability to hammer a simple, resonant message of economic dominance, and turns it into a weakness. He built a cage for Canada based on trade dependence, and Prime Minister Carney is now picking the lock and walking out, leaving Trump holding a key to a door that's no longer the only way out. Crucially, this isn't about appeasing Donald Trump. It's a calculated move by Canada to assert its own strategic autonomy in a world where the United States is no longer seen as a reliable economic partner. For decades, Canadian policy was built on a simple premise: the American market will be there. That assumption is now dead. Prime Minister Carney's actions are a direct response to an era of American unpredictability. Whether it's Trump threatening to tear up the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, or launching a trade war, Canada has recognized that it can no longer afford to outsource its economic security. This economic pivot is a declaration of independence from Washington's approval. It's Canada stating in the clearest possible terms that it will control its own destiny. This shift was signaled when Carney said that the deep economic integration the two countries have enjoyed for generations is now over. This was a radical departure from the traditional Ottawa consensus. The strategy to double non-US exports and focus on the Indo-Pacific and Europe is a tangible plan to make this happen. It is Canada finally taking responsibility for its own economic fate, moving from being a passenger in the American economic vehicle to building its own. This also dramatically alters the US-Canada relationship. The dynamic is no longer one of patron and client. It's moving towards a partnership of necessity and competition. The upcoming 2026 review of the USMCA trade agreement is now set against this backdrop of tension and Canadian assertiveness. The trade war, with its tariffs on key goods, is now laid bare as a purely economic conflict, detached from the veneer of national security. This gives Canada more leverage in negotiations. It can now argue that the punitive economic measures are harming both nations, all while it actively builds trade relationships with other global partners. In essence, Prime Minister Carney is calling Trump's bluff. Trump always presented the relationship as a one-way street, with the US giving and Canada taking. By actively pursuing economic diversification, Canada has proven it is willing and able to reduce its dependence, changing the entire nature of the conversation. Now, there is a counter-argument here that we have to address. It's the argument you'll hear from Trump's supporters. See? Trump's pressure worked. He bullied them, and now he's getting a better deal for America. And on the surface, you can see why they'd say that. Did years of American pressure, culminating in Trump's relentless trade war, force this issue to the top of Canada's political agenda? Absolutely. It would be naive to suggest otherwise. The constant economic threats from their largest trading partner were impossible to ignore. But to conclude that this is a win for Trump is to fundamentally misunderstand why Canada is making this pivot. It's not opening up new markets out of respect for Trump's transactional worldview. It's doing it because his own actions have convinced them that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. Think about it. Canada isn't diversifying its trade because it feels more secure in its relationship with America. It's doing so because it feels profoundly less secure. When a U.S. president openly threatens to scrap trade deals and uses national security as a pretext for punitive tariffs, the rational response is not to put more faith in America, but to build up your own economic resilience as a hedge. The diversification strategy is an insurance policy against American economic volatility. So, yes, Trump was a catalyst, but he was the catalyst for a reaction that ultimately weakens American influence. He wanted Canada to remain a dependent partner he could control. Instead, he is forcing it to become a more resilient, globally connected competitor that can function with less reliance on the American market. He might win a few battles in the trade war, but he may have lost the war for America's privileged position in the North American economy. This is a massive shift, and it leads to some big questions. What does this new era of Canadian economic strategy look like on the world stage? And more importantly, does this fundamentally change the US-Canada relationship for the better by creating a more balanced partnership, or does it signal a permanent drift apart? Drop your prediction in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see what you all think, and if you're getting value from this analysis, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We're going to be tracking this story for a long time to come. Just as Canada begins this economic pivot, the goalposts are already being set for the next major conflict, the 2026 Joint Review of the USMCA. This review, once seen as a simple administrative check-in, has now become a high-stakes negotiation that could determine the future of North American trade. This gives Donald Trump a new platform to exert pressure. We can already hear the sound bites. He's already called the deal he negotiated no longer relevant. He will absolutely use the review to demand more concessions, threatening to scrap the deal entirely if he doesn't get his way. However, the dynamic is different this time. By launching a bold diversification strategy, Canada has bought itself significant leverage. It is no longer negotiating from a position of total dependence. It can now say, "We are committed to North American trade, but we are also building a future where our prosperity isn't tied to the political whims of one partner." It transforms the conversation from one of a student being lectured by a principal to one of partners discussing a shared but uncertain future. This forward-looking goal also serves Carney's domestic agenda. It creates a long-term framework for rebuilding Canada's industrial base and revitalizing its global trade relationships. It signals to allies and adversaries alike that this pivot is not a short-term reaction, but the beginning of a sustained generational commitment to economic autonomy. Canada isn't just trying to survive a trade war, it's planning for a world where it's a more serious and independent economic power. For decades, the story of Canada's economy was one of ever-deepening integration with the United States. Donald Trump didn't create this dependence, but he exploited it masterfully, turning trade into his single most powerful instrument of leverage against a key ally. He used it to paint a picture of a nation that needed to be kept in line. With a strategic pivot towards economic self-reliance, Prime Minister Mark Carney has started to tear up that picture. By launching a national strategy to diversify trade and build domestic strength, Canada has done more than just respond to tariffs. It has begun to neutralize Trump's most potent political weapon. It has declared its intention to pursue a path of strategic autonomy in an increasingly unpredictable world. And it has fundamentally reset the terms of the US-Canada relationship, moving from a dynamic of dependence to one of strategic competition. This is not the end of the story. The 2026 USMCA review looms large, ensuring that trade will remain a central issue for the next decade, and skeptics are right to point out that diversifying an entire economy is a monumental task that will take years, not months. But a fundamental shift has occurred. The old narrative is dying. Canada has taken a decisive step to control its own destiny, not out of deference to Washington, but out of a clear-eyed assessment of its own national interest. The question is no longer if Canada will withstand the pressure. The question now is what it will do with its newfound economic resolve. And for Donald Trump, the man who built his political identity on America's economic dominance, he will have to find a new card to play, because his biggest one is losing its power for good.